Right, so here we are, the climax of the day. Not really, it's just another of the same. And before, I'm sure none of you would, but before any of you think of saying, what's the best treatment for long COVID? The answer is all of the above, right? There is no conflict between all of these. And in fact, I'm glad, for instance, that I'm not talking about vitamin D because everybody else has done it for me. There'd be no news here, would they? So, firstly, I wanted to say this. For 17 years in the OMNS, we've been spreading the truth about nutrition in medicine. And for 2 years now, slightly over, we've been saying this simple message: nutritional therapy works on COVID as it does on all viruses, right? Now, January 26, 2020, Andrew Saul wrote the first release on that. More recently, in January this year, I wrote this one. Saying, saw this sign outside the local primary school, and I thought, a bit extreme, but then when I thought about it, in the novel 1984, Mr. Smith works at the Ministry of Truth, which rewrites history and rewrites truth and so forth. And Newspeak, what we're dealing with, is characterized by a continually diminishing vocabulary. Complete thoughts are reduced to simple terms of simplistic meaning. For instance. But it gets worse, really, because this was recently released by the, whatever the regulatory authority is in Australia, saying that health practitioners are obliged to ensure their views are consistent with public health messaging. Views expressed which may be consistent with evidence-based material may not necessarily be consistent with public health messaging. And it's clear which you have to go for. All the years we've been saying, oh, this is evidence-based, you used the term I've seen this morning, so well, out the window. So I want to introduce you to the concept of acute induced scurvy. This was described first by Robert Cathcart in 1981, I think, yes, right. And he said in this article, every flu he's seen has been cured or ameliorated by massive doses of ascorbate. And in post-COVID syndrome, you've seen this sort of list several times today. Every time, breathlessness is the second on the list in order of prevalence, right? And that's because the lung tissue is definitely preferentially invaded by SARS-CoV-2. And as they say, it's very common for infected patients to develop acute respiratory distress syndrome, which is associated with large amounts of inflammation and damage on the alveolar capillary barrier. And this was confirmed just a couple of weeks ago by a paper from Imperial and a few other places. Such a pretty paper, right? Didn't have to deal with these graphical abstracts when I edited a journal, honestly. And what this says is post-COVID-19 patients showed abnormal airway, but not plasma proteomes, with an elevated concentration of proteins associated with apoptosis, tissue repair, epithelial injury, and so on. It's like we were talking earlier, I mentioned the microglial findings be carried on for 18 years. Same thing can happen here. COVID-19 causes a prolonged change to the airway immune landscape in those with persistent lung disease, cell death, tissue repair, ongoing activation of cytotoxic T cells. Now, vitamin C, we know, can suppress the cytokine storm, reduce the thrombotic and diminish alveolar and vascular damage, but the dose is important, as Sarah was saying earlier. And the Cathcart said, if doses of ascorbate are not provided to satisfy the draw on the nutrient that's going on, first local tissues become deficient, so that'd be the lung, then the blood, so then you get the other effects, and then the body in general becomes depleted of ascorbate. And then you've got acute induced scurvy, and that's when you end up in hospital and previously, God help us, on a ventilator, which just did physical, mechanical damage to the lungs on top of the biochemical damage. Yeah, so that one I mentioned in questions earlier, so don't need to talk about that. One of the first things we found out about long COVID, post-COVID syndrome, etc., was in an article in The Atlantic magazine online, and that was back in, it's about a year ago, April, I think. And they said they looked at they talked to the few people that were then researching long COVID, and in one instance it was because there were several academics in the one institution who are actually suffering from it themselves. Evidence began to accrue that long COVID patients were breathing shallowly through their mouths and into their upper chest. By contrast, a proper death, you know this. So a proper breath. They said they were going to be entertained, but I didn't know it was going to be this way. A proper breath stimulates the vagus nerve along the way, helping regulate heart rate and the nervous symptoms. So this is heart rate variability, which is effectively the only measure we have of ventral vagal tone, right? So similar symptoms, oh, sorry, I need to go back. Similar symptoms, fatigue, shortness of breath, racing heart, occur in people who have low carbon dioxide, hypercapnia, which can be triggered by hyperventilation or shallow, rapid breathing through the mouth. So what they did, they put the people into a small pilot trial, and then only had about 10 people to begin with, I think. A small pilot trial of just breathing exercise. And basically it's the same breathing as you get in yoga, meditation, relaxation therapies of all sorts. And specific treatments for breathing pattern disorder. But the amazing thing is, after a week, everyone in the pilot program reported improvement in symptoms like shortness of breath and also the fatigue. So it's not just the lung symptoms that it's treating. Now, I learned a lot about this earlier on from the post-COVID syndrome group, which is patient-driven. I wouldn't call it a patient support, but it's a community of patients online. And they have asked me to make clear that when it says organizations sponsoring ongoing post-COVID research, that's not them. That's a list of people they know about who are sponsoring. I said, you can't say that we're sponsoring research. Some of us are on benefits, for God's sake. So they definitely aren't funding anything like that. And what they established was that, lists like this really made the difference. And they said the niacin is interesting, but we haven't really got time to go into it in detail. They said niacin was probably the front runner of all of these, but the people who did best were the people who did everything. And I think that what they should do also is bring in the breathing and other measures for the vagus. So lightening revision of the vagus nerve, which serves almost all the internal organs and almost all the gut. And 80% of it is afferent. It signals from the internal to the brain. And basically, it seems to me that if you call it a feeling, then it's mediated by the vagus. So, it's heartfelt. You've got a gut feeling. You feel it in your water, all of these. And it comes from the base of the brain here, midbrain, and it's the 10th cranial nerve. It's the second largest nerve trunk after the spinal cord. So spinal cord, biggest nerve out, vagus, second one. And it's affected, the gut, for instance, there are a load of chemoreceptors and mechanoreceptors, so you can tell what's going on in the gut. And two of the important signals are lipopolysaccharide, which is produced by bacteria, a range of bacteria. And basically it's lipo, so the lipid down the bottom there sticks it into the cell membrane. And the rest of it is saccharide, 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 whole load of saccharides. They're infinitely variable, really. But it's not a big jump from looking at that to think that maybe all sugars can have a dodgy effect on how our gut operates and so forth, right? There's a test that we now use, I'm starting to use, which measures lipopolysaccharide binding protein. And the reports say this is induced within a few hours by both gram-negative and gram-positive germs and germ constituents. And therefore, it triggers the what's known as the lipid whistle response. It triggers the TLRs, the toll-like receptors on macrophages. And so it activates the immune system, simple as that, really. The other messenger molecule is butyric acid, which these people said the presence of butyric acid at an appropriate physiological concentration in the colonic lumen is interpreted by the body as information that the bacterial equilibrium is not disturbed. So that gives you a happy vagus. And you can actually look at it, and this is a happy vagus in the neck between the carotid and the jugular, and it's meant to be in that kind of triangular shape because it's compressed by the vessels and so forth. This is an unhappy vagus that I took from somebody. It's not that clear, is it, actually? But so I took from somebody earlier this year with long COVID, by the way, and you can see that it's not triangular, it's swollen, it's literally swollen, it's bulging into the vessel there, and you can see dark little spots of interstitium between the individual nerve fibers there. So that's an unhappy vagus. The polyvagal theory suggests that there is an old vagus that we don't have to worry about here, but that's the one that puts you in hospital flat out like that with tubes in everywhere. Okay, your system shuts down to protect you. And then you get, next up is the sympathetic fight and flight. And then the new vagus allows you to do the rest and digest, the feed and breed, as somebody put it. And then you integrate these together and you get interest in things like trust and play and so on and so forth. But there's a simple statement my colleague David Peters always said: stress makes you stupid, right? And it makes you stupid long before it makes you sick. It makes you stupid because it's activating these low down primitive reflexes and so forth, including the fight and flight and so forth. But the new vagus gives you a whole load of other options. It allows you to access the higher brain, really, get away from the lizard brain and access the higher brain. So let's look at it in context here. I need to take a minute to explain this chart to you. It's a little bit complicated. This is from Navio's cell danger response writing, which is utterly brilliant stuff. Going through the columns here, on the left is health, and then right on the right is restored to health. And then so moving in time across from the left, you go, there's an injury, and a whole bunch of things happen, and then gradually health is restored. And so the top line is the polarization of mitochondria. So what the mitochondria are doing, right? Are they the M2 mitochondria, which are normal energy producing ones, or have they been converted to M1 inflammation driving mitochondria? As somebody put it, power plants into battleships. The second one, and this is also interesting, is connectivity. So they're in health and their connectivity is good. The cells are communicating with each other. And that's one of the key things that vitamin D does, is to promote tight junctions between cells, and that is also effect from the vagus. So that's important. The third line is oxygen usage, right? But the bottom one there is ventral vagal tone. So up there, that's full on ventral vagus working nicely. RSA stands for respiratory sinus arrhythmia. So it's heart rate variability, in other words, right? And then when things go into battle mode, whatever, the vagus tone pretty much disappears, or very possibly just simply overridden by the sympathetic. That can happen too. And you get these abbreviations: the ARDS, acute respiratory distress syndrome; MODS, multi-organ dysfunction of sepsis. I think dysfunction is kind of a nice word for sepsis, isn't it? And these ones are all, those are chronic fungal infections and acute staphylococcal and chronic fungal infections, chronic bacterial infections, Gulf War illness, diabetes, cancer. Okay, you can figure out a lot of the rest. So this is how the mitochondria, the MO mitochondria, those ones there, right? They're primitive, they're undifferentiated, as you would find in stem cells, and they will provide the energy for rapidly growing cells. M1, which are those ones there, are inflammatory reactive oxygen species, free radical producing, and the M2 are normal, healthy, oxidative phosphorylation functioning ones. So you get an injury, everything switches into battle mode. Now, where's that? Yeah, there you go. This is the point. The M2 mitochondria can rapidly and easily repolarize into M1 inflammatory mode. But M1 mitochondria activation blunts the oxidative phosphorylation and prevents the return. So the conversion into battle mode, into M1 mitochondria, that's rapid and pretty much instantaneous. But to get the M2 mitochondria back, you can't necessarily convert them all back into it. You have to produce new ones. That's where the MO ones come in, right? So it's a slower, complicated business. But you can see that obviously there's, because it's so multifactorial, so complex, it's impossible to say this is the chicken, this is the egg. You know, it happens in this sequence. But it's clear that vagal activity is key to this whole process. And so as you restore vagal activity, you gradually bring back the healthy M2 mitochondria. Now, how do you do that, or how does that happen? Happens with the cholinergic anti-inflammatory pathway. And so here we go, paper on exactly that. Vagal nerve stimulation reduce lung messenger RNA levels of N1 macrophage markers while increase those of M2 macrophage markers. And also, there are, remember, memory T cells, turn out to be rather important for COVID and for immunity. There are circulating classes of memory T cells that contain CHAT, the enzyme choline acetyltransferase, and therefore release acetylcholine in response to vagal nerve stimulation and activate important anti-inflammatory macrophages. So these are the things that the cholinergic anti-inflammatory pathway does. It inhibits the inflammatory macrophages and supports the anti-inflammatory ones, and it increases the expression of tight junction proteins. So that's how it improves the communication between cells, the connectivity, right? There are two main pathways. The one, there's the pathway to the macrophages in the gut, and another is to the macrophages in the spleen, because the spleen doesn't have parasympathetic innervation. So it has to go, there's a quick conversion from, I don't know what to call it, overground to underground, like changing tube line, in the ganglion, and the splenic nerve sends the signal to the spleen. So you remember that in post-COVID syndrome, you get these sort of symptoms, and just a week of breathing exercises can make a difference to the whole thing. But if you work on vagal nerve stimulation, you can achieve a lot more, right? How do you do this? Well, the very slow abdominal breathing, consumption of bioactive fats and oils to stimulate cholecystokinin, gargling, singing opera songs. I'm not sure why it has to be opera, but maybe just has the sustained notes or whatever. Retention enema does it, and just gently stimulating the gag reflex with a tongue depressor. Or you can use a device like the Sensei, which I do use. Believe me, I don't have shares in that. Kind of wish I did, really. That's a vibrating thing. The little pebble sits on your chest there, and it's connected to an app on the phone, and you have the headphones in, you get a binaural signal through the headphones. So the left sound is subtly different to the right sound. You can't perceive the difference, but it entrains your brain waves. And all you hear is, you know, the whale music or temple bells or whatever. And at the same time, this thing here vibrates and sends a signal up the vagus to the brain, which then sends messages down to the macrophages in the gut and in the spleen saying, calm down, dears, stop producing inflammatory mediators, but keep on producing the anti-inflammatory ones. So there we go. That's almost it, really. I just want to talk about another important role for the nutrients in this is to do with sleep. I don't have time to go into the work of Stasha Gominak, but if you Google her, it's brilliant stuff. Gominak. She's a neurologist in Texas who started off dealing with sleep apnea and kind of stumbled into all this stuff, right? It's clear vitamin D, good vitamin D levels are necessary for the production of the enzyme coenzyme, the chat enzyme, right? And what that enzyme does is it converts acetyl-CoA, which you got from vitamin B5, converts the acetyl-CoA into coenzyme A and into acetylcholine, right? So for that, you need good levels of vitamin D in the brain, and you need good levels of vitamin B. And how this connects with the microbiome is that the papers have figured out that pretty much all of the major healthy bacteria in the gut have a defect of some sort in their production of the B vitamins. Those defects are replaced, or whatever the word is, by the other groups of bacteria. So we need the healthy bacteria to produce B vitamins for us. This is well known, but they need them as well. They need each other. So that means that one way of promoting a healthy gut bacteria is simply to give a B complex supplement. You should probably add that in as well, because they need it as well as we do. What they also need is vitamin D. And the only, being there where the sun don't shine, the only way they're going to get that is from us. So that's why our vitamin D levels need to be higher for that. And the other thing about lightning warning about the chat enzyme is that proton pump inhibitors act with unprecedented potencies as inhibitors of the enzyme. Right? So you do have to be careful of those medications. And the other thing is that we need good lifestyle and so on and so forth. I suppose this is another Orthomolecular News Service one by Albert Louis. He says, stress, already a major problem, is being magnified 100 times by the pandemic. Can't argue with all of that. So simply, people need good sleep. They need some time spent outside in the sun. They need forest bathing, connection with nature. They need good water to drink. They need good nutritious food, not processed food. They need something to do with their loneliness. So the pandemic has had indirect effects on all of those factors, hasn't it? So there we are. There's some solutions. Thank you very much.